Listen with absolute attention, because what Rudolf Steiner revealed about the inner child will shatter the illusion you maintain about being a functional, mature adult, will expose the devastating truth that much of your current behavior doesn't come from conscious, rational choices, but from a wounded child of 3 or 5 or 7 years old who was never seen, never healed, never integrated, and who continues operating in the shadows of your psyche, controlling your emotional reactions, sabotaging your relationships, limiting your possibilities, keeping you trapped in patterns that formed decades ago when you were too small to understand what was happening and too vulnerable to defend yourself. The child you were is not dead past, not archived memory you can choose to access or ignore, but is a living, active dimension of your current consciousness, a sub-personality that continues feeling and reacting and influencing your choices from the wounds and fears and unmet needs it carries from childhood. And until you recognize this child, see it, hear it, understand what it needs, and finally give it what was always missing, you will remain unconsciously controlled by it, an adult only in appearance, but a wounded child in deep psychic structure. Steiner observed through clairvoyant perception that the human being is composed of multiple temporal layers, that experiences from each life phase don't simply disappear, but form strata in consciousness, and that the child you were between 0 and 7 years, before the etheric body fully liberates and before reflexive consciousness fully develops, this child remains as a deep nucleus influencing everything that comes after. The impressions absorbed in this period, when consciousness was open and unprotected, when you had no developed psychological defenses, when you completely depended on adults for physical and emotional survival, these impressions engrave themselves not just in memory, but in the energetic structure of the etheric body, in the configurations of the astral body, forming patterns that persist throughout life unless consciously worked with and transformed. Research in developmental psychology, especially attachment theory by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, documents that relational experiences in early childhood create internal working models that persist into adult life, determining how you relate to intimacy, how you handle conflict, how you regulate emotions, what type of partners you choose, how you behave when you feel threatened or abandoned. Studies on complex trauma and development show that emotional neglect or abuse in childhood produces lasting changes in neurobiological systems, affecting stress regulation, emotional processing, social connection capacities throughout life. Research on adverse childhood experiences shows direct correlation between early trauma and physical and mental health problems decades later, evidencing that the wounded child literally makes the adult sick. The signs that a wounded inner child is controlling your adult life are unmistakable once you learn to recognize them. Emotional reactions, disproportionate to present situations, being triggered by minor events that evoke ancient wounds, exploding in rage or collapsing into despair in ways you yourself recognize as exaggerated but cannot control. Repetitive patterns in relationships where you always end up in the same painful dynamic regardless of who the partner is, always attracting or being attracted to people who recreate original wounds, always ending relationships in the same destructive way, because the inner child is trying to reenact and finally resolve past traumas through present partners. Self-destructive or self-sabotaging behaviors, are harmful, but continue repeating, sabotaging success when you're about to achieve it, destroying relationships when they start getting intimate, maintaining addictions or compulsions that clearly don't serve you, because the wounded child believes it doesn't deserve love or success or happiness, carries shame or guilt or belief in fundamental inadequacy formed decades ago. Now, Steiner reveals why the first 7 years are so crucial, so formative, so determinative for everything that comes after. Because this is the period when the physical body is being formed through the forces of the etheric body, when the nervous system is developing its basic structures, when fundamental capacities for trust, security, love, self-esteem are being established or not, when the soul is making its first complete descent into physical matter and the conditions of this landing. Determine how you will inhabit your body and your life for the next decades. During these first 7 years, the child lives primarily in the etheric body, in a dreamlike state of consciousness where boundaries between real and imaginary are fluid, where spiritual perception is still active, where learning happens not through intellectual instruction, but through imitation and absorption of the emotional and energetic environment around them. The baby and small child are completely open, have no developed psychological defenses, absorb everything from the environment like a sponge, and this total openness means that everything happening in this period imprints deeply, not just as cognitive memory that can be retrieved or forgotten, but as structuring of the very etheric and astral substance that forms the foundation for all future personality. The child who grows in an environment of consistent love, attentive presence, physical and emotional security, with caregivers who respond appropriately to their needs, develops what attachment researchers call a secure base, fundamental trust in the world and in themselves, capacity to regulate emotions and form healthy relationships that will persist throughout life. This child internalizes the message, I am lovable, the world is safe, I can trust others and myself, and this fundamental belief becomes the lens through which all future experience is filtered. The child who experiences neglect, abuse, extreme inconsistency, trauma, or simply lack of emotional presence and attunement from caregivers develops insecure attachment and absorbs very different messages. I'm not enough. Something is fundamentally wrong with me. The world is dangerous. People are not trustworthy. Love is conditional or unavailable. My needs don't matter. These fundamental beliefs, formed before language and logical thinking fully develop, become somatic truths, bodily knowings that operate below the level of rational consciousness, influencing every relationship, every choice, every emotional reaction for the rest of life, unless they are consciously identified and transformed through deep therapeutic work or intense spiritual practice. Steiner emphasized that healthy development in early childhood requires 3 essential elements: unconditional love, where the child feels completely accepted exactly as they are; presence, where caregivers are genuinely present instead of physically present, but emotionally absent or distracted; in an environment that protects the dreamlike quality of child consciousness, instead of forcing premature intellectual cognition or exposing the child to stimuli that are violent or inappropriate for their developmental stage. When these elements are present, the etheric body can complete its work of forming healthy physical structure. The astral body can develop harmoniously, and the ego or true I can gradually incarnate into a vehicle that will support it appropriately. Modern research on neuroplasticity and critical periods of development validates Steiner's observations, showing that the first years are a unique window when the brain is forming its basic structures, when neural circuits for emotional regulation, social processing, stress response are being established, and that experiences in this period have disproportionately large impacts compared to experiences in later phases. Studies on extreme deprivation in institutionalized children show that early childhood development that doesn't receive appropriate stimulation and relationship produces permanent deficits that are very difficult to remediate even with intensive later intervention. Research on resilience shows that the most important factor for overcoming adversity is having had at least one secure attachment relationship in childhood, one person who saw, valued, and consistently responded to the child. What makes this period so crucial and so tragic is that the small child has no capacity to understand that problems in the environment are not their fault, automatically internalizes any caregiver failure as evidence of their own inadequacy, develops what Alice Miller called the drama of the gifted child, where the child learns to adapt, to perform, to be who caregivers need them to be, to obtain love and attention that are basic survival needs. This adaptation creates a false self, a persona constructed to ensure connection and safety, while the true self, the authentic child with their real feelings and needs, is hidden, denied, eventually forgotten, remaining buried in the psyche where it will continue influencing the adult in ways they don't recognize or understand. Now Steiner points to one of the most profound and least recognized tragedies of modern human development, that the process of growing up in contemporary culture inevitably involves the death of essential aspects of child consciousness, loss of capacities and qualities that children naturally possess, but which adults systematically suppress through socialization, education, and pressure to conform to norms that privilege rational analytical thinking over imaginative and intuitive perception, that value productivity and control over spontaneity and wonder, that demand clear separation between real and imaginary instead of honoring the permeability that allows creativity and spiritual perception. When you grow up in the conventional sense, you're not just gaining new capacities, but losing others. And these losses, because they're never acknowledged or mourned, create invisible wounds, unnamed emptiness, indefinite nostalgia for the state of being that was sacrificed on the altar of adult maturity. The first and most obvious loss is the capacity for total presence in the present moment, a quality that small children naturally demonstrate, completely absorbed in immediate experience, without mental division between observer and observed, without constant internal commentary on experience, simply being instead of constantly thinking about being. Adults lose this capacity, develop a mind that's always in past or future, always commenting and judging and comparing instead of simply experiencing, and spend years in meditative practices trying to recover what they had naturally at age 3, the capacity to be completely present without the interference of compulsive thinking. The second loss is living imagination, the capacity children have to create entire worlds through play, to transform stick into sword and box into castle, to experience these transformations as real instead of just pretending, to inhabit imagined realities with a totality and conviction that makes play genuine exploration instead of mere representation. The third loss is natural spiritual perception, The capacity many children demonstrate to see or feel the presence of spiritual beings, to have memories of past lives or of the period between incarnations, to perceive energy fields around people and places. And these perceptions are systematically discredited by adults who insist they're just imagination or fantasy, training the child to doubt their own perceptions, to accept the materialist vision of reality that denies dimensions they can directly perceive. The fourth loss is emotional spontaneity, authentic and unfiltered expression of feelings as they arise, crying when sad, laughing when happy, expressing anger when frustrated, without the layers of control and suppression and performance that adults develop, without concern about how emotions will affect others or what they'll say about you, simply allowing feelings to flow through without grasping them or denying them. The fifth loss is insatiable curiosity, the natural impulse to explore and discover and ask endless questions about everything. Why? Being the small child's favorite word, and this curiosity gradually dies under the weight of schooling that punishes too many questions or wrong questions, that demands passive absorption of information instead of active exploration, that rewards obedience and conformity instead of independent thinking and genuine investigation. The sixth loss is deep connection with body and nature, the childlike capacity to move with freedom and non-performative joy, to roll in grass and feel mud between fingers and observe insects for hours, sensory and kinesthetic connectivity that adults lose as they become increasingly cerebral and disembodied, living in their heads instead of in whole bodies. Steiner taught that these losses are not necessary, are not the inevitable price of maturity, but are the result of a development model that privileges certain types of consciousness over others, that treats development as linear instead of spiral, as pure gain instead of a series of trade-offs where each new stage involves both acquisitions and sacrifices. Research on creativity shows that children are naturally more creative than adults, that imagination and divergent thinking systematically decline with age and schooling, that recovering creativity in adult life frequently involves unlearning aspects of conventional conditioning. Studies on presence and mindfulness show that the natural childlike capacity to be present is a quality that adults must work hard to recover. Research on perception shows that children notice details and make connections that adults don't see because adults have more rigid perceptual filters. The tragedy is not just that these capacities are lost, but that the loss is not recognized, never mourned, never processed as real and significant loss, but simply accepted as normal and inevitable. That's growing up. And this lack of mourning for the child you were, for the capacities you had, for the way of being in the world that was sacrificed, creates profound dissociation, a split between who you were and who you became, unnamed nostalgia that drives compensatory behaviors, and unconscious attempts to recover what was lost through means that can never truly satisfy because they don't recognize what's really missing. Now we enter territory where modern psychology and Steiner's spiritual teaching converge. The recognition that childhood trauma, whether large, obvious trauma like abuse or severe neglect, or small cumulative trauma like consistent emotional invalidation or lack of caregiver attunement, creates fragmentations in the psyche, where parts of the child become frozen in time, trapped in the traumatic moment. And these wounded parts continue operating autonomously in adult life, being activated by triggers that evoke original wounds, controlling behavior and emotion in ways the rational adult doesn't understand and cannot control through willpower or intellectual insight alone. The wounded inner child is not metaphor or abstract psychological concept, but is a real subpersonality with its own perspective and emotions and needs, a dissociated part of you that was separated from main consciousness, because the feelings and experiences it carries were too intense to be integrated at the moment they occurred. Steiner observed that trauma creates ruptures in the subtle bodies, especially in the astral body where emotions reside, and in the etheric body where life patterns are maintained, creating areas of stagnation or distortion where energy doesn't flow freely, where experience wasn't processed and remains as undigested material influencing the entire system. These ruptures are visible to clairvoyant perception as dark or discolored areas in the auric field, as blockages or knots in the energetic structure, and these distortions in the subtle field eventually manifest as physical symptoms or psychological patterns or relationship difficulties, the unprocessed trauma finding indirect pathways to express itself because it cannot be kept repressed indefinitely without consequences. Research on complex trauma by Bessel van der Kolk and others has extensively documented how trauma, especially early developmental trauma, gets stored in the body and nervous system instead of just in cognitive memory. That trauma changes brain functioning, particularly in areas related to emotional regulation and threat processing. That traumatized people live in chronic states of hyper or hypoarousal, the nervous system stuck in survival mode even when real danger passed decades ago. Studies on dissociation show that severe trauma produces fragmentation of consciousness, where different parts of self emerge in different contexts, a phenomenon ranging from mild dissociation everyone experiences to dissociative identity disorder in extreme cases. But the underlying principle is the same. When experience is intolerable, consciousness splits to protect the essential self. Signs of wounded inner child controlling adult life include emotional flashbacks, where you suddenly feel exactly like a small, frightened, or lonely, or ashamed child, regressing to infantile emotional states without conscious connection to present trigger. Relationships where you're constantly trying to get from the partner what you didn't receive from parents, looking to them to fill a primal void, and inevitably being disappointed because adults cannot give what caregivers should have given in childhood. The developmental window has passed. Addictions and compulsions that serve to soothe or numb the wounded child, behaviors that on the surface seem self-destructive but which are actually desperate attempts at self-regulation, ways of managing unbearable feelings you didn't learn to process in healthy ways when you were small. Self-sabotage patterns, where you destroy good things in your life because the wounded child doesn't believe it deserves love or success, carries shame or guilt or belief in fundamental inadequacy that was implanted too early to be challenged by adult reason. Constant hypervigilance, inability to relax completely, always scanning environment for threats, living as if the original trauma is still happening, nervous system stuck in defensive pattern that was appropriate when you were vulnerable but now keeps you exhausted and isolated. Extreme difficulty with vulnerability and intimacy because the wounded child learned that closeness brings pain, that trusting leads to betrayal, that showing needs results in rejection or punishment, so it built thick walls that now prevent the connection you consciously desire. The work of healing the wounded inner child requires addressing trauma, not just cognitively, but somatically, emotionally, energetically, using approaches that allow dissociated material to be gradually integrated into consciousness without re-traumatizing. Methods like EMDR, somatic experiencing, internal family systems therapy, trauma-informed bodywork, practices that recognize that trauma is stored in the body and nervous system and must be released through these pathways, instead of just through intellectual insight or cathartic reliving. Steiner observed that the small child possesses extraordinary capacities that in most people atrophy during the growing up process, but which if preserved and consciously developed could transform adult capacity for creativity, spiritual perception, learning, and connection. The first of these capacities is learning through integral imitation, not just copying observable behavior, but absorbing the energetic and emotional quality of person or situation. The way children learn language, not through instruction, but through total immersion in the linguistic field. The way children learn movement and expression, not through analysis, but through direct embodiment of what they observe. This capacity to learn holistically without conceptual mediation, to simply absorb and incorporate instead of analyzing and trying to understand intellectually first, allows rapid and integrated acquisition of complex skills that adults struggle to develop when trying to learn everything through linear analytical method. The second capacity is active imagination, not passive imagination, where you consume images created by others, but creative imagination, where you generate entire worlds internally, where simple toy becomes vehicle for elaborate narratives, where internal reality is as vivid as external reality and can be inhabited with totality and conviction. This capacity is the foundation for all genuine creativity, for innovative scientific thinking as much as for art, for the capacity to visualize possibilities that don't yet exist and bring them into manifestation. Adults who maintain or recover active imagination are the innovators, artists, visionaries who transform entire fields because they can see and experience internally what others don't yet perceive. The third capacity is non-dual presence, a state where there's no division between subject and object, where the child is so absorbed in activity that separate self temporarily disappears, a state that flow researchers try to understand and meditation practitioners try to cultivate, but which the small child enters naturally through play. This capacity for self-forgetting, for being so present in experience that there's no separate observer commenting or evaluating, is the foundation for expanded states of consciousness, for mystical experience, for moments of profound insight where solutions emerge because conceptual thinking has stopped interfering. The fourth capacity is synesthetic perception, integrated experience where senses aren't separated but mix, where the child sees sounds as colors or feels emotions as textures, a phenomenon that researchers study in adults with synesthesia, but which Steiner observed to be much more common in small children before education forces rigid separation between sensory modalities. This integrated perception allows forms of knowledge and creativity that segmented adult perception cannot access. The fifth capacity is natural empathic connection, the way small children instantly respond to others' emotional states, crying when a nearby baby cries, feeling tension in a room before adults consciously notice it. This direct sense of the collective emotional field that adults lose as they develop more rigid ego boundaries and learn to focus on their own internal experiences instead of remaining permeable to others' experiences. Research on cognitive development has documented what Piaget called pre-operational thinking of childhood as an inferior stage to be transcended. But more recent researchers recognize that children have forms of intelligence that are different but not necessarily inferior to formal adult thinking. Studies on language learning show that children acquire languages with an ease adults cannot equal, suggesting special capacities in this period. Research on creativity consistently shows that children are more creative than adults, that conventional schooling reduces rather than increases divergent thinking and originality. The tragic thing is that modern culture not only fails to preserve these capacities, but actively suppresses them, forcing children prematurely into academic education that privileges verbal analytical thinking over imagination and integrated perception, exposing children to electronic media that provides ready-made images instead of space for their own imagination, creating structured schedules that eliminate time for free and undirected play that is the context where these capacities develop. Steiner emphasized that appropriate education would honor and cultivate these childhood capacities instead of trying to force children prematurely into adult frameworks, allowing imagination to flourish, protecting the dreamlike quality of child consciousness, giving abundant time for play and exploration instead of filling days with formal instruction. Now Steiner reveals why small children frequently have experiences that adults classify as imagination or fantasy, but which are actually genuine perceptions of spiritual dimensions. Because children haven't yet completely finished the incarnation process, still maintain connection with the spiritual worlds from which they recently came, still have natural clairvoyant perception that only gradually closes as the ego anchors more completely in physical body, and as materialist education insists that only the physical world is real. The small child, especially before age 7, exists simultaneously in physical dimension and spiritual dimension, can see and interact with beings that adults don't perceive, has memories of past lives that gradually fade, maintains awareness of guardian angels and other spiritual beings that accompany them, and reports these experiences naturally until learning that adults don't believe, that these experiences are discouraged or ridiculed, at which point the child learns to suppress perceptions that don't fit the materialist worldview being imposed. Steiner taught that the child before age 7 lives primarily in the etheric body, in a state of imaginative consciousness, where the boundary between thought and perception is fluid, where internal images and external impressions mix. And in this state, the child is naturally permeable to spiritual impressions, can perceive energy fields, can sense the presence of disembodied entities, can access memories that transcend current life experience. This is not pathological or problematic, but is a natural developmental stage that should be respected and protected instead of suppressed and denied. When adults consistently invalidate the child's spiritual perceptions, insist that imaginary friend doesn't exist, or that the things the child sees are just fantasy, the child learns to doubt their own direct experience, learns to close subtle perception, gradually loses the capacity to perceive non-physical dimensions that then remain inaccessible in adult life, unless the capacity is recovered through intensive spiritual training. Research on children's reports provides intriguing evidence validating Steiner's observations, even though conventional researchers typically interpret data within materialist frameworks. Studies of past life memories in children by Ian Stevenson documented thousands of cases where small children reported verifiable details about previous lives they couldn't have known through normal means. Research on near-death experiences in children shows that children report encounters with beings of light and transcendent realities similar to adults, but often with more clarity and less filtering through cultural beliefs. Studies on infant perception show that babies and small children perceive aspects of reality that adults filter out, have less rigid perceptual filters. What makes this spiritually significant is that the child is portal, bridge between spiritual and physical worlds, and adults who maintain genuine connection with their own inner child maintain some of this permeability, some access to perceptions and knowledge that transcend the purely rational and material. Mystics and clairvoyants and visionary artists are frequently those who preserved or recovered the capacity to perceive as children perceive, to see with eyes that aren't completely filtered by adult concepts and expectations, to remain open to dimensions of reality that materialism insists don't exist, but which direct experience reveals as real and meaningful. Now we arrive at the practical work of actually making contact with the inner child, of hearing it, validating it, finally giving it what it always needed but never received. A process Steiner saw as essential not just for psychological healing, but for spiritual development, because there can be no genuine integration, while dissociated parts remain unrecognized. There can be no wholeness, while the wounded child continues operating in the shadows, controlling behavior and emotion in unconscious ways. The work begins with simple recognition, taking regular time, ideally daily, to sit in silence and consciously invite the inner child to make itself present. Create internal space where it can emerge without fear of judgment or rejection. Allow images or feelings or memories to arise, without trying to control them or force them to make sense immediately. Often, the first times you try this contact, the child won't come because it learned not to trust, was rejected or ignored so many times that it built defenses, so patience and consistency are essential, continuing to create the space and invitation until trust gradually develops. When contact begins to happen, it often comes first as feelings without images, a sensation of smallness or fear or loneliness, or it may come as sudden memory of forgotten event, or as image of yourself at specific age. The crucial thing is to receive what comes without judgment, without trying to fix or change, simply being present with the child exactly as it is, validating its feelings, instead of trying to convince it that it shouldn't feel that way. The next phase is dialogue, developing bilateral communication, where you as conscious adult speak with the child and listen to its responses. This can be done through writing with non-dominant hand, which often allows the child to express itself more directly, or through active imagination where you visualize the child and have conversation with it, or through bodywork where you feel where the child is holding tension or pain in the body and allow expression through movement or sound or crying. Essential questions include, what do you need from me? What are you feeling? What do you want me to know? What were you never allowed to say? And then actually listening to the responses that emerge, even if they seem irrational or contradictory or inconvenient. The deepest phase is re-parenting, where you as adult consciously provide for the inner child what it didn't receive: unconditional validation, attentive presence, protection, permission to feel and express everything without censure, assurance that it is loved exactly as it is. This is not just imaginative exercise, but real work that restructures the psyche, creates corrective experiences that gradually heal original wounds. Specific practices include visualizing yourself as adult entering childhood scenes and protecting or comforting the child you were, speaking aloud to the inner child, offering reassurances you never heard when you were small, allowing yourself to do things the child always wanted but never could, giving symbolic gifts to the inner child. Research on compassion-focused therapy and internal family systems therapy validates this approach, showing that cultivating a compassionate internal adult voice that can respond to wounded parts produces significant changes in symptoms of trauma: depression, anxiety, shame. Studies on neuroplasticity show that corrective experiences, even imaginary ones, can produce real changes in brain circuits. Research on mindfulness and self-compassion documents that treating yourself with kindness instead of harsh criticism improves psychological well-being and capacity to face difficulties. The work of healing the inner child is a long process that unfolds in layers. Each time you think you've completed it, you discover another deeper layer, another age where wounds exist, another part that needs attention. This is normal and appropriate, not a sign of failure, but recognition that human development is complex and trauma operates on multiple levels that must be addressed sequentially, cannot be resolved all at once through single insight or dramatic catharsis, but requires patience, persistent commitment, willingness to keep returning to the child, even when it's painful, even when you want to believe you're already healed and can move on. Now Steiner points to a deeper and transpersonal dimension of the inner child, not just the historical child you were at specific age with specific wounds needing healing, but the eternal child, archetypal aspect of yourself that never ages, that remains perpetually new and open and full of wonder, regardless of how many years your physical body has lived. This eternal child is part of what Steiner called the ego or true I, the spiritual core that reincarnates multiple times but maintains essential qualities through all incarnations. And one of these qualities is childlike openness, capacity to approach each experience as if it were the first time, to maintain curiosity and wonder that doesn't wear out with repetition or accumulated knowledge. The eternal child is not wounded, doesn't need healing because it wasn't damaged by trauma or conditioning, exists at deeper level than personality and its formations, is aspect of self that remains untouched no matter what happens on the surface of existence. This is the child Jesus referred to when he said, "Unless you become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." Not infantilized or immature child, but child in the sense of radical openness, fundamental trust, capacity for wonder, absence of cynicism, and hardening that comes from living in fallen world. Accessing this eternal child is different from working with wounded inner child. Instead of going back to heal past, you go inward to meet timeless dimension of yourself, source of perpetual renewal, wellspring of freshness that never runs dry. The practice of connecting with the eternal child involves meditation that moves beyond memory and personal history to encounter with archetypal quality, entering states of pure presence where there's no narrative about who you are or what happened to you, just clear, open awareness. Meeting present moment without filters of past. This can happen spontaneously in moments of beauty or wonder, when nature reveals something so surprising that thinking stops, and you simply see with eyes that are simultaneously yours and more than yours. Eyes of eternal child, who has seen beauty in thousands of forms through many lives, but never tires of witnessing it again. The eternal child is what keeps life fresh, even when circumstances are familiar, what allows you to continue growing and learning even in old age instead of becoming fixed in rigid patterns, what brings spontaneity and playfulness to adult existence without being false or forced. People who maintain contact with eternal child have quality of youthfulness that's not about physical appearance, but about energy and openness. Eyes that still sparkle with curiosity, laughter that's genuine and not performative, capacity to be surprised and delighted that hasn't been killed by repetition or disillusionment. Research on successful aging documents that people who maintain openness and curiosity and willingness for novelty experience slower cognitive aging and report greater life satisfaction. Studies on mindfulness show that cultivating beginner's mind, approaching familiar experiences as if they were new, increases well-being and reduces rumination and worry. Research on flow states shows that moments of total absorption, where self-consciousness disappears, are accessed more easily when you approach activity with playful, exploratory attitude instead of goal-oriented drive. The path to the eternal child passes through but also beyond the wounded child. You must first heal historical wounds, integrate dissociated parts, make peace with past, but then movement continues deeper to discover what was there before wounds, what remains untouched under all layers of trauma and conditioning, crystalline core of consciousness that is simultaneously most intimately you and transcendent of small self, the child you always were and always will be, regardless of the body's age, or complexity of personality that developed around it. Steiner dedicated decades to developing Waldorf education precisely because he recognized that conventional education was systematically destroying essential childhood capacities, forcing children prematurely into adult frameworks, killing imagination and curiosity and spiritual openness through an approach that privileged mechanical memorization and control over organic development and creative expression. His principles for education that preserves instead of destroys the child's essence begin with respecting developmental stages, recognizing that different ages require completely different approaches, that trying to teach abstract concepts to a 5-year-old is not just ineffective but damages healthy development, forcing premature intellectual cognition at the cost of foundations that must be established first. The first 7 years, birth to 7, should be dedicated primarily to play and imitation, allowing the child to absorb the world through direct sensory experience and movement instead of formal instruction, protecting dreamlike consciousness instead of forcing it to awaken prematurely. Education in this phase happens through example and environment, adults being worthy of imitation, space being arranged to stimulate imagination and safe exploration, daily and seasonal rhythms being established that give structure without rigidity. Introducing letters and numbers before age 7 is seen as violation of the child's developmental needs, forcing the head to engage before foundation in will, and feeling is adequately established. The second 7 years, 7 to 14, is when formal learning appropriately begins, but through methods that engage imagination and feeling instead of just intellect, stories and images instead of abstract facts, art integrated into all subjects instead of treated as extra, learning through doing and creating instead of just consuming information. The teacher stays with the same class for all these years, developing deep relationship that allows true pedagogy, teaching that responds to individual needs instead of applying uniform method for all. Assessment through grades and tests is avoided, replaced by narrative descriptions of each child's progress and challenges, recognizing that children develop at different times and in different forms that cannot be adequately captured by standardized measures. The third 7 years, 14 to 21, abstract thinking finally becomes appropriate, but still balanced with practical work and artistic expression, students engaging with great philosophical and scientific questions, while also developing practical skills and creative expression. The goal is not to produce efficient workers or obedient consumers, but to develop whole individuals who can think independently, feel deeply, act morally, connect with spiritual dimensions of existence, while also functioning effectively in material world. Research on alternative education, including studies on Waldorf schools, shows that graduates report greater life satisfaction, more engagement in arts and social activism, healthy identity development, even though standardized academic performance measures are variable. Studies on impact of early introduction of formal academics show that starting formal instruction later produces no long-term disadvantages and may have benefits for intrinsic motivation and love of learning. Research on importance of play shows that free and unstructured play is essential for healthy development of social skills, emotional regulation, creativity, problem solving. Principles that parents can apply even if they cannot access Waldorf education include drastically limiting screen time, especially for young children, recognizing that electronic media interferes with development of imagination and presence, prioritizing free play and time in nature over structured activities and formal instruction, reading to children instead of just placing them in front of videos, engaging in creative activities together instead of just consuming entertainment, protecting rhythms and routines that give security. Most important, being genuinely present with children, not just physically present, but emotionally available and attuned, because attentive presence of loving adult is the foundation upon which all healthy development is built. Finally, we arrive at the goal of all this work with the inner child, not remaining fixated on childhood or infantilized in adulthood, but achieving genuine integration where childlike qualities and adult capacities coexist, where you can access the wonder and spontaneity and presence of child while also manifesting the wisdom and responsibility and perspective of elder, where each developmental stage is honored and available instead of earlier stages being discarded or denied as you progress. Steiner taught that true development is ascending spiral instead of straight line. You return to qualities of earlier stages, but at higher level of integration. Not literal childhood, but recovered innocence. Not child's dependence, but child's openness combined with adult's strength and knowledge. The integrated adult can play genuinely without self-consciousness, can be silly and spontaneous when appropriate without fear of seeming immature, can feel deeply, allow emotions to flow without being dominated by them, can approach experiences with freshness even when they're familiar, maintain curiosity and wonder that hasn't been killed by knowledge or cynicism, can trust deeply while also being discerning. Not naive trust that ignores danger signs, but fundamental trust in life's goodness, even knowing suffering and betrayal exist. Can be authentically vulnerable instead of defending against vulnerability or performing it manipulatively. Simultaneously, the integrated adult has developed capacities the child doesn't have, can maintain long-term perspective, can delay gratification when necessary, can tolerate ambiguity and complexity, can take responsibility for own actions and their consequences, can perceive others' needs and respond with maturity instead of just reacting from own needs, can contain and regulate intense emotions without suppressing them or being overwhelmed by them. Has wisdom gained through experience, understands patterns and consequences child cannot anticipate, can offer guidance and protection to younger ones. Integration means you can move fluidly between these states depending on what situation requires, can be responsible, trustworthy adult when that's needed, can be playful child when context allows, can be wise elder when guidance is requested, aren't fixed in any role but can access resources from all stages. Practices supporting this integration include maintaining regular work with inner child even after initial healings occur, ongoing relationship instead of one-time project, cultivating both discipline and spontaneity, structure and freedom, seriousness and playfulness, recognizing that apparent opposites are actually complementary, seeking experiences that integrate multiple dimensions, creative art that's simultaneously disciplined and expressive, nature that evokes childlike wonder and deep contemplation, relationships that allow both vulnerability and strength. Research on psychological integration and wholeness shows that people who can access multiple aspects of self depending on context, instead of being rigidly fixed in one way of being, report greater well-being and effectiveness. Studies on lifespan development show that healthy aging is not about abandoning youthful qualities, but about integrating them with mature wisdom. Research on post-traumatic growth shows that people who work through childhood wounds often develop capacities for intimacy, authenticity, and resilience that exceed those who didn't have to do this work, scars becoming sources of strength instead of just vulnerabilities. The final teaching is that the inner child is not problem to be solved or project to be completed, but is permanent dimension of who you are, perpetual source of renewal and freshness and connection with spiritual dimensions, and honoring this child, maintaining loving relationship with it, allowing its influence in your life instead of banishing it to psyche's dungeons. This is not regression or failure of maturity, but is genuine integration, real wisdom, recognition that you are simultaneously eternal and temporal, simultaneously divine child and mortal adult, and living from this wholeness instead of just from fragments is what constitutes being whole human. The person Steiner saw as ultimate goal of development, free individual who can act from love because they've integrated all aspects of self and can therefore manifest spiritual essence through human form without distortion of dissociation or division, expressing child, adult, and elder as unique facets of unitary being that is simultaneously personal and transpersonal, temporary and eternal, human and divine.